Our Old Testament lesson for this morning is from the book of Genesis, chapter 45, verses 3 through 11 and verse 15. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 3 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He's made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all of Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty.' And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him." Our New Testament reading for today is from the book of Luke, chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer him the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do unto you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he's kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure that you get back." So ends the reading of our New Testament lesson for this morning.
I got to say that God has been tough on me this month because the readings assigned in the lectionary, they are all really difficult readings. Today is going to be especially difficult because we're being told that we need to love our enemies. And that does not sound easy to me. At the center of Jesus' teaching, we know, is the Great Commandment. It appears in each of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as you love yourself. The Great Commandment requires a lot of us. It challenges us. Well, in today's reading, Luke takes this a step further in saying that we must even love our enemies. Now, loving God with everything we have is something we often need to remind ourselves constantly to do. And loving others the way Jesus tells us to when we need to, it's tough. Loving ourselves is really tough because we are often our biggest critics. I don't know about you, but I think at night about mistakes I made during the day, and sometimes I'll go over them and over them and over them, and it makes sleeping kind of tough. Or maybe we've wronged somebody 25 years ago, and trying to sleep at night, that's what comes into your head. It can be difficult to love ourselves, but if we can't love ourselves, it becomes even more difficult to love anyone else. Love God, love ourselves, love our neighbors, and all means all, and love your enemies too. In fact, verse 31 says it all pretty concisely, and it's one that we are all familiar with. Do to others as you would have them do to you. The golden rule is a really tall order, especially these days when there's so much division in the world. I know of someone who does not speak to her oldest daughter. Her oldest daughter, it seems, decided that she wanted to make amends with a father who had left the family when the girl was 10 years old. And after so many years of not knowing that father, this daughter decided she wanted to be in touch with him. She wanted to try to establish a relationship with him. And she does it. This, though, was too much for the mother, who had raised her by herself. She stopped answering her daughter's calls. She refuses to see her daughter to this day. She refuses to forgive the husband who left. She refuses to forgive her daughter for loving her father. Now, in the two readings we're focused on today, there are a couple of rather disturbing lessons. Of course, I've mentioned love your enemies as you love yourself. That's pretty tough. But there's more, because in the Genesis reading, God is not just calling us to love our enemies, God is calling us to forgive those who persecute us. And we hear this in the New Testament as well. In either of these readings, there is no call for retribution, and Joseph is definitely in a position now to inflict a very powerful retribution if he chose to. You remember Joseph, right, in the Old Testament? He's the one with the beautiful multicolored coat that his father made for him. He was clearly his dad's favorite. And his brothers got tired of him bragging and strutting around as the favorite son of the father. So the brothers decided they needed to get rid of him. They were going to kill him, but it actually looked to be a little bit easier just to sell him into slavery. And he did that. They did that to Joseph. And Joseph was taken away to Egypt by the men who bought him. Now, Joseph ended up a slave in Egypt, but after demonstrating his ability to interpret dreams, he kind of made his way up the ladder because people were impressed by this ability. And so he became very powerful in Egypt, ultimately. And yet, years later, when Joseph's brothers turned up in Egypt, starving because of a famine back home, Joseph recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. So he toys with them for a little while. He had recognized them immediately, and he realized that he had forgiven them. They had hated him so much that they wanted him dead, yet he loved them even though they wronged him. We have to remember that Joseph is acting not just as a formerly mistreated brother. He's a powerful person now, determining Egyptian policy toward his brother's tribal unit. And here he is welcoming those brothers after all these years, forgiving them completely. And he does help them, and he keeps them from starvation. He has no interest in getting back at them because he's forgiven them. His decision will save the lives of thousands of people, if not millions, and not just Joseph's immediate family, clearly. As such, Joseph is a model for us, even today, to let our actions be governed by the better angels of their nature, and not just caprice or retribution or expediency. Joseph is the ultimate example of not just loving, but also forgiving those we perceive as having harmed us. Joseph not only forgave his brothers, but he helped them in a big way. Theologian Bruce Epperly writes, "Retribution has no place in a healthy world, but is the work of cramped spirits, living in the past and not leaning toward the future." But what is this business in Luke anyway from Jesus in this gospel? He says in so many different ways that we are to love our enemies. Now that's just plain crazy talk to the average person. Reverend David Lose writes that this instruction to love our enemies isn't so much a command, but rather it's a promise. It's a promise that Jesus is showing us how the kingdom come to earth might look if we could forget about our need to hate, our need to have enemies, our need to retaliate. We are living in a world, perhaps now more than ever, where so many believe this: love deserves love, hate deserves hate. Deeds both good and bad should be repaid in kind. Force has to be returned with force. Violence begets violence. When you forgive, when you love and forgive your enemies, you interrupt this unhealthy cycle, the destructive cycle, and you create something new. Love itself, defined most simply, is seeking the good of another above your own. It's not a means to an end, but it's an end in itself. And it creates morality and the justice that we all crave, and all the rest of the things that we strive for. We find manifest in love, where there is mostly hate of others. When you imagine that Jesus is offering us an invitation rather than simply giving a new set of rules, everything sounds different, and it's kind of easier to take, I think. But Luke says it best with this passage: Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not condemn. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure that you get back. There was a movie that came out in 2018 that David and I went to see, and it's one of those movies that stuck in my memory. There are a few of those, and this is definitely one of them. It's a biographical movie. The African-American musician, Dr. Don Shirley, is a gifted, very gifted, classically trained pianist in the 60s. He's going to be traveling in the South to many venues so that he can perform, decides that he needs a bouncer because it's not safe for him to go there. And so he hires a bouncer, this really tough, rough guy, a New Yorker named Tony Vallelonga. And Tony agrees to drive him to all the venues throughout the South. Well, they received an education from each other as they traveled together in the Jim Crow South at the time. Dr. Shirley was used to being put in his place by white people, and though it hurt him, he was willing to walk away from trouble. Tony Vallelonga, not so much. And he saw for the first time what it meant to be a person with dark skin in parts of this country. He had a more difficult time walking away from the trouble. And after Tony got to know Dr. Shirley, Tony was a changed person. And he defended Dr. Shirley whenever he needed to be defended. And he himself got into trouble doing this. We'd like to believe that we are the best at being a nation of Christians loving others. But there are still people, even in our own neighborhoods, who are motivated by hate. Love your enemies. I believe that when we love humanity, we begin to see everything with new eyes. We begin to see our fellow humans as humans, people who might be injured in some way by their upbringing, people who might be in trouble in some way, people who we just haven't known. And once we know them, we realize that we are all God's children. So I say this to you. We like to say that if you're Christian, life gets easy. Well, life doesn't get easier if you're a Christian. I'm telling you, it gets harder. Life gets harder because being a Christian is not easy. We like to say that when we are followers of Christ, everything will be okay. And I'll tell you that if we really are following Christ, everything will be okay. A Canadian pastor, Leanne Friesen, wrote in a 2016 article for Christian Week about a trip she took to Lebanon. Before she went, she hadn't realized that there had been a civil war in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990. And the perpetrators of the war were assisted by Syrians. And so there were some terrible stories about things that the Syrians did to the Lebanese. Well, in 2011, Syria broke out into its own war, and the people from Syria began leaving in hordes, trying to get away from the war, and the closest place for them to go was Lebanon. They were seeking safety in great numbers, and Reverend Leanne wrote this: I didn't really know anything about the hurt and suffering felt by those who lived through the war and the long-term pain caused between Syrians and the Lebanese as a result. She said, I heard story after story from people, but a few of them really stuck with me. One pastor in a sermon said that his father was killed by Syrians. 20 years later, he reaches out to thousands of Syrian families as they are made comfortable in his church, as they come to this new place. A few weeks ago, he invited a Syrian refugee to the front so he could wash his feet in front of the whole congregation to remind them what it means to love and forgive. His church has grown from 60 to 900 people. A woman also told a story about being taken at gunpoint before Syrian soldiers back in the 70s. She said, "I held my baby close and I prayed for God to take me first." This Lebanese woman who prayed at gunpoint in the 70s is part of a church that cares for 500 displaced Syrian families in Lebanon. And every week now she visits. She has tea with these people who were her enemies, but now they're all her friends. She said, "Learning to love your enemy is really hard, but boy, does it ever bring blessings." So Christians in Lebanon had to make a real choice. The choice between loving or hating their enemies when those Syrian enemies were now all around them and were hungry and lonely and homeless. The people doing good things are the same people who sat under siege a generation before, and now they're loving their enemies, one food basket at a time. As I think about the situation of my friend, who is so angry with her daughter that she refuses to even speak to her, I often tried to make her understand what God requires of us. Now, she's a Christian. She calls herself a Christian, and yet this forgiving is so hard for her, and it is hard. We might all wish that Jesus had given us a much easier way of seeing the world, an easy out. He didn't say you don't have to care for your enemy. He said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And this is what we are called to do, to love those around us, whether they are friends, family, acquaintances, people we've only heard about, if there are enemies too. I ask that God will give us all the strength we need to turn any enemies that we have into friends. I want to close by reading the Psalm of the day, just part of it, Psalm 37. Do not fret because of the wicked. Do not be envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in God and do good, so you will live in the land and you will enjoy security. Take delight in God, and God will give you all the desires of your heart. Amen.